It is a downright tragedy that all major religions violate and change the very principles of freedom once they become huge organizations run by religious bureaucracies. This has happened in all religions. Eric Fromm, psychoanalyst and sociologist. Institutionalism. Somehow we should get rid of these fine forms of waste, liquid waste. I refer to them as liquid because they are very delicate. They are hard to spot and even harder to capture. This waste is found in the ISKCON holy waters, where it creates a foul stench, foul enough to make many of its members distance themselves from it, or worse, leave altogether. Such fine waste is a problem for many organizations, whether religious, state or commercial. The reform efforts are justified in the first place because it is a spiritual organization founded by a pure devotee of the Lord, Srila Prabhupada, who is our life and soul. Institutionalism is another form of this liquid waste that discourages people from accepting spiritual refuge. According to Webster's dictionary, institutionalism is a characteristic intransigence with an emphasis on the organization as such at the expense of other factors, capable of spreading in public or private institutions and influencing the attitude of its representatives. Uncompromising is the key word, and it is likely to appear in every organization at some point. How do we find out if an organization has become uncompromising or uninstitutionalized? That's a good question to which there are many answers. Let's approach one of them and draw parallels between the development of organizations and a business, which, as is known, has 4 phases. These development phases are broad and can be applied to other entities as well, such as religious institutions. The first phase of the enterprise is the entrepreneurial phase. It caters to a small number of customers, has a small market share, and is creative and aggressive. Its strength lies in high-quality goods and services that attract customers. The second or growing phase is characterized by change, adaptability, and innovation. The business becomes team-oriented with the growing market. The third or formal phase is characterized by leadership that has been formed in an established culture. Other symptoms are formal structures with a fixed, immobile, and often bureaucratic to complacent mood that is resistant to change and innovation. The fourth, dying phase is dominated by crisis and selfish interest, in which mediocrity and inviolability, uncriticism of the institution are firmly established. The above analysis can be understood more deeply in the context of religious history. In this light, however, we can have a little insight into the history of the ISKCON. The first phase can simply be imagined at 20th 2nd Avenue, with its relatively small but creative beginning, continuing for several years until, say, 1970. The second phase may have occurred in the 1970s, when most of the temples were established and Srila Prabhupada traveled a lot and also founded the GBC. The third phase, with its well-defined zones, management meetings and infrastructure, arrived in the 1980s. To know the difference between the first and third phase, you just have to look at a few Back to Godhead magazines or Vyasapuja books from the 60s to early 70s, where these tributes were written long before various clichés and hackneyed phrases entered our society. You will find there a certain feeling and freedom of speech that was sometimes formulated in Judeo-Christian jargon, in the voice of the cultural environment of our Western members. Some of these tributes may sound idealistic, yet they were so warm and genuine. These days they are still available, but I dare say to a much lesser extent. It seems as if a kind of aloofness has settled between us. You can also consider the fourth stage. Of course, Lord Chaitanya's movement will not die, and we would like to think about our organization as well, but ISKCON has to go through some serious changes to survive. These changes will be decided and carried out by the Lord. Prabhupada said. Yes, that is preaching. That's why we write so many books. If we don't take care of them and don't read and preach them ourselves and understand the philosophy, this Hare Krishna will end after a few years. Because there will be no life in it. That's why it's declining. Churches are closing. Similarly, if you also do not keep yourself in a suitable condition for preaching, all your temples will eventually disappear. This was said during a morning walk, on the 12th of December 1973, in LA. One day, as the devotees and I were driving along the highway in a van, I was thinking about the problems of our society and felt somewhat discouraged. I looked out the window and saw an old and rotten tree stump on the side of the highway. At one time, he had to support a huge tree, judging by its size. A fresh green flowering shoot grew out of it, which must have been his offspring. At that moment I suddenly understood the meaning of that tree. I felt hope come to me as an answer to my despair. Our movement will survive either way, no matter how difficult it may be. There is nothing to be afraid of. However, the external form of the ISKCON can change in some way. The old one falls away to make way for the new one. My point is confirmed by Dhrudakarma Prabhu, who wrote recently, "A new ISKCON will arise and be based on authentic and personal relationships in devoted service, not on legislative and bureaucratic systems of government." It is not my intention to overdramatize things or, on the other hand, add credibility to deviant sections. In other words, the idea of new shoots can be explained in their own way by apostates such as Ritviks, Sahajis, Pseudo-Babajis, New Age mystics, and so on. My intention is to one day see an authentic, orthodox form of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, as envisioned by Prabhupada. Full of love, trust, honesty and freedom. Unfortunately, many dedicated and disinterested observers are now seeing signs of something different. Despite this, almost nothing is being done about these problems. According to Burke Rockford's 1996 survey, ISKCON shows signs of authoritarianism. Many devoted respondents expressed their view that ISKCON suffers from poor management and that its leaders are not always responsive to those they serve. There is reason to suspect that this only breeds mistrust and a sense that these local or regional leaders are distant from the needs and lives of average members. Phrases like "not always responsive" and "distant" suggest an authoritarian approach. ISKCON shows signs of authoritarianism and institutionalization, according to former Gurukula students in their 1999 presentation to GBC. Two young ladies, Krishna Devata Desai and Shakuntala Desai, declared without shame, "I see a group of people in front of me who simply sold out. It is no longer about the absolute truth. Most of you are distant from yourself and from everyone else. How many formal resolutions do we have to write before we realize that this is not a structural problem? We face mutual alienation and isolation. Our movement no longer has Prabhupada's living force, his vision. We are fragmented, uninspired and disenfranchised in our false illusions about this movement. As a movement, we no longer trust our leaders, nor do we trust ourselves." Ironically, most of the early members joined this movement based on its revolutionary spirit and bold, penetrating statements about the absolute truth that threw a materialistic and numb society right in the face. A member of the GBC, Bhakta Tirtha Swami, commented on this trend. "This is how the body signals that something is wrong, by vomiting or diarrhea. It is better to know about the bacteria that enter the system. If we notice that we lack enthusiasm, this is a signal that something is wrong. And when we find out that the whole community is in the same situation, it already means serious problems." I agree with Swami. When we know about the problem, we can solve it. The problem won't go away if we pretend it doesn't exist. Symptoms are signals on the basis of which we must act in order to achieve a remedy. Otherwise, there is only one option: to continue to suffer. Knowing that some leaders are aware of these issues gives us hope. Bhakti Tirtha Swami later adds, "It is often difficult for leaders to change their way of thinking. Many years ago I went to Switzerland to work for the United Nations. I preached to some diplomats there, but I quickly began to notice that they were in a world of their own. I worked mainly with the leaders of third world countries and I began to notice that they owned some limousine or Mercedes and collected pounds, marks or dollars. Then, When they return to their country, they play big and visit some of their friends to show off. They may not be part of the environment they represent at all. And so, consciously or subconsciously, they lose touch with the real problems and needs of their population, because often, whatever happens, it doesn't even affect them. We have seen many cases where leaders have lost touch with the needs of others. For example, a leader who has special meals may not know that the devotee's prasadam is inadequate. Another example is that wherever a leader comes, he is treated with respect and given what he needs, so he doesn't even have to suspect that devotees in general may not even be welcomed. One respected senior devotee gives a specific example. In one temple, the local GBC and the temple president have a so-called no guests policy, because one time their guests stayed longer than they should have and they were a burden, they couldn't just get rid of them. Although this is the official policy of this temple, they accept guests if they are disciples of the local guru or come to support the temple. Devotees who want to move to the local community but do not want to work full-time for the temple cannot stay even for a few days until they find housing. Local leaders seem to lack sympathy for the plight of decent devotees. Then, when a local GBC member travels, he receives accommodation and a welcome. He is out of touch with the hardships that devotees have to face when they travel to his zone and have to stay overnight in an expensive hotel. If this same view is expressed by many persons from different quarters, even using the same terminology, it is quite possible that it is true. One way to tell if you or your organization has become institutionalized is for people to tell you. It has been suggested that people at the top are aware of these problems. Professor Larry Shin wrote an article entitled Reflections on Spiritual Leadership. Message of Srila Prabhupada. He claims in it, "The good news is that there are many signs in America, Europe, and elsewhere in the world that gurus and other religious leaders are accepting that they need to live and act more in a way that is consistent with their teachings. Conferences held in Europe over the last 6 years reveal a more contrite and apologetic tone of devotees' public speaking and self-presentation. But Prabhupada's legacy was even richer in what lessons it had for the devotees of the day. The quality of one's spiritual growth and practice must be the basis for one's theological scholarship of the scriptures and one's public and private actions.